I'd like to welcome everyone to our NDPTC third Thursday webinar or seminar for April. We have a pretty packed agenda today. I see we have a big attendance as well. This month's discussion is on the Turkey, Syria earthquake that occurred earlier this year. We've had some response activities in the area, and we have some other people that were doing some work there. But before we start, we want to kind of congratulate one of our graduate assistants, Amy Kitchener. She's completing her master's degree in the Department of Earth Sciences. She's a volcanologist. She'll give a brief 5 to 10 minute kind of discussion of her I guess her presentation or her oral defense, which is happening tomorrow. So Amy.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, and let's get going. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the timing of recovery for critical infrastructure in Lower Puna from the 2018 eruption at Kilauea and some implications. My research is focused on Puna, a district located on the island of Hawaii in the southeast rift zone of Kilauea. Specifically, I chose Puna because it lies within hazard zone 1 and 2, which are the areas most at risk when an eruption occurs. Even though Kilauea is one of the most active volcanoes on our planet, the unprecedented cost of the 2018 eruption in Hawaii reflects the intersection of physical and social events. The heightened threat from Puna from these lava flows in the East Rift Zone ensured that land values were always depressed. This translation of high risk to low land prices attracted people. This rapid population growth occurred in the absence of any locally sourced eruptions between 1961 and 2018. This set the scene for the unprecedented level of infrastructure damages during the 2018 Lower East Rift Zone eruption that altered communities and lands for generations. The event itself lasted over 3 months. It covered over 35 square kilometers of land and destroyed over 700 structures, many of that being residential neighborhoods. In the end, it damaged 51 kilometers of road, 23 kilometers of water lines, and over 900 utility poles. Here's a quick map from NDPTC that I just love. The pink shapefile is the extent of the lava flow itself. The black dots that you see are destroyed infrastructure, and the blue and red lines that you see are impacts to the roads. Now, I'd like to point on the left-hand side of the screen is Highway 130, and although not directly impacted by the lava flow itself, this is the main highway that connects Lower Puna to the rest of the island. And again, it did suffer some damage, not by the lava flow itself, but due to fissures and dikes going underneath the highway and seismic activities causing cracks, gaps, and some damages. So that was a lot of black dots. So what about the homes? Well, in response to this eruption, the County of Hawaii's Kilauea Disaster Recovery Team launched a housing recovery survey back in February 2021. This was to help guide recovery efforts, and this was preceding a buyout deal. In the end, they sent out over 1,200 surveys and received 815 responses. 55% of the homeowners indicated that they still lived on island. 238 of them lived in Puna. 706 houses were inundated. 29 were isolated in kepukas or just holes, and 30 suffered thermal damage. 593 were owner occupied at the time of the eruption, and 85 were rentals. 625 homeowners were indicating that they were likely to pursue the buyout deal once offered. 192 wanted to regain access to their properties. 47 wanted to retain their land, meaning there was no homes on the property, it was just agriculture land. And 213 remained uncertain on what to do. So the buyout deal was officially initiated in April 2021. $107 million was used in federal funding to acquire these properties. And they buy out your property for up to $230,000. This was to minimize future impacts and also to maintain these sites as open spaces. Homeowners are going through the very difficult choice of accepting the buyout deal and moving, or risk redeveloping their property. And when I say redevelop, this is not with sewer lines, no running water, no electricity. They would live off the grid if they chose to stay. So infrastructure takes time to rebuild completely, and this may delay a community's healing time. As I was researching this study, I noticed numerous studies on the properties to the damage, or the damage to the properties, or even the physical characteristics of the lava itself. However, there is a gap in literature on the critical information. Specifically, the literature lacked consolidated information on the critical infrastructure damages and the recovery efforts of road access, water, and electricity. My study had to gather information from various news sources, publications, articles, and even public videos to holistically understand the recovery efforts and the expansion of that infrastructure that has been put into place or will be put into place in the coming years. When consolidating this information, it highlighted implications for landowners as a result of these efforts. And I wondered, how does the lack of a comprehensive plan to the loss of infrastructure and recovery impact the overall perception of resiliency in Lower Puna? So this is a little example. I have 4 tables. I have road access, water, electricity, and one for the geothermal power plant. And I would gather it by date, location, and just a brief description. Now, I only have 10 minutes, so I'm gonna go over it really fast. I'm just gonna consolidate it. So there's numerous projects. For instance, FEMA's come in and have 2 proposed projects for road access and water lines, different phases. But skipping over all of that important information, I would like to highlight the electricity. I feel like this best encapsulates what I was finding. So over 900 utility poles were destroyed. However, the recovery project is not just replacing these damaged poles, they seek to make it bigger and better. They are enabling broadband capability, internet, and phone connection. And this is also in response to COVID-19, producing more remote work and study opportunities. So there's this general trend of not just replacing what was lost, but bringing it back bigger, better, and expanding it. So a useful comparison to 2018 is Kalapana. Between 1990 and 1992, lava flows mostly buried the town of Kalapana. However, in spite of this dissolution, the draw of a barren landscape enticed eager individuals to consider coming back and building simple structures on the fresh flow. Despite the draw of new residents, these houses have no running water, no electricity. They live off the grid. However, not everybody lives off the grid in Lower Puna. The whole community wasn't destroyed. There was pockets of destruction. The extensive networks of roadways, linking bridges, and utilities and buildings required to maintain everyday life are considered key components of critical infrastructure. These essential systems are necessary for the economic lifeblood and the activities or sectors that can grow inside a community and are essential for economy. In short, for the effective functioning of Lower Puna, there needs to be road access, water supply, and electrical continuity. This means establishing safe, accessible, and affordable systems. However, people are still continuing to buy existing homes, even with the relative unavailability of insurance. In Leilani Estates, there have been 5 home sales in the past 3 months. This is a screenshot I grabbed on April 16th. You can see you can still buy a lot of property, some in the unaffected part of the neighborhood, but you can even buy property on the fresh flow. For instance, in one of the lower right-hand ones for 160,000, you too can have this fresh flow. And this is what that property looks like. There's no structures, nothing, but you can buy and still live there. Also, the rise of, also due to COVID-19, produced an increase in remote employees coming from outside of Hawaii, falling in love with the isolated lifestyle and buying property. The rise of new residents is in direct contrast to the buyout deal's efforts to discourage population growth in Lower Puna. Remember, the buyout deal's mission is to prevent future impacts. Is the recovery and enhancement of critical infrastructure contributing to this population growth? The recovery plan is both complex and promising, but its ultimate success remains uncertain. And it's also dependent on which lens you're going to be looking through. But without having that solitary, holistic information on the timeline to damages and the recovery efforts that have taken place or will take place, it's difficult to measure overall resiliency in Lower Puna. Seeing that the recovery effort in Lower Puna remains uncertain and ongoing, there's various future studies one can consider examining. One future study could look into measuring the current and future perception of risk in this area. This could stand alone or be combined with any trends in population growth. Another worthwhile study would include an in-depth look at if the expansion of recovery efforts are leading Lower Puna into a false sense of resiliency. Lastly, there's a potential duality of perspectives that can be adopted within the singular framework of the buyout deal itself. The buyout deal's endeavor at curtailing movement and construction in these high-risk zones. One plausible avenue for exploration would be the comprehensive evaluation of the buyout deal creating a better, more resilient community in Lower Puna. The other trajectory pertains to investigating the extent to which the timing of repairs to critical infrastructure has influenced the acceptance or rejection of the buyout deal. I hope by me consolidating the timing of damages and the recovery efforts of critical infrastructure in Lower Puna incentivizes more studies as these, so we can build the most resilient communities worldwide. And I'm over time, so I'll say mahalo.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, if you have questions for Amy, we'll leave it for the end of our session. Okay, our first speaker on the subject of Turkey and earthquakes is Dr. Helen Januszewski. She's a geophysicist, seismologist at the University of Hawaii Department of Earth Sciences. She received her PhD from Columbia University, and her research focuses on deep crustal structure and magma storage, as well as some technology-related stuff, amphibious seismic imaging of subduction zones and broadband ocean bottom seismology. Okay, Helen, you should be able to.
Great. Can you see my slides okay and hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So yes, I am here today to give a brief overview of the tectonics and scientific understanding of the 2023 Turkey-Syria earthquake sequence. So jumping right into it, one of the first questions that you can ask when you hear about an earthquake occurring, particularly a large magnitude earthquake occurring, is why here, right? What were the tectonics of this region? What fault zones exist in this region to have generated this earthquake? And Turkey is well known for being an area that is very tectonically active. Most of the country is made up of what is called the Anatolian block in the center portion. And it is bounded by two fault zones, the North Anatolian fault to the north, and then the East Anatolian fault to the southeast here. The Anatolian block is essentially being squeezed between three much larger tectonic plates, the African plate, the Arabian plate, and the Eurasian plate. And you can kind of imagine almost that it's, if you're holding like a button or something and squeezing it, and it eventually would pop out of your fingers if you keep squeezing it. The Anatolian block is shooting out to the west as the forces from these plates are pushing it out westwards. So both the East Anatolian fault and the North Anatolian fault have historically hosted large magnitude damaging earthquakes, and they really define the region's high seismic risk. But the North Anatolian fault, which is a right lateral system, was kind of more famous for quite a while, in particular in the 20th century from 1939 to 1999. There were a progressively westward series of earthquakes. The map on the bottom showing the red dots with years, those are all major historical earthquakes. And so that sequence on the North Anatolian fault culminated in 1999 with the Izmit earthquake, which was very devastating, causing about 17,000 deaths. The East Anatolian fault is also well known to be seismically active, but had been quieter compared to the North Anatolian Fault prior to the 2023 events. It regularly produced mid-6 magnitude earthquakes. That's in contrast to the many magnitude 7s that were present on the North Anatolian Fault in the 20th century. But I do want to emphasize, and I apologize for the blurriness of this, I couldn't find a higher resolution image, but this is a seismic hazard map put out by authorities in Turkey. And so I do want to emphasize that just because the East Anatolian Fault prior to this earthquake sequence hadn't been quite as seismically active, it was well recognized that it was an area of high seismic risk. So these the map is showing seismic risk. The dark colors are higher values, and you can see they reach just as high of a level on the East Anatolian Fault strand as on the North Anatolian Fault strand. And I should mention this is a map from 2018, so prior to any of the recent events. So what happened in February? This is the sequence of earthquakes. So on February 6th, there was a magnitude 7.8 on the East Anatolian Fault and Dead Sea Fault, followed by several smaller aftershocks. Those are the ones shown in orange. And then about 6 hours later, there was a magnitude 7.5 earthquake, and it ruptured a different orthogonal fault. And then everything shown in blue on this video are the earthquakes that came after that 7.5. And so this was a very complicated set of events rupturing multiple fault zones. And just a reminder again, when you're seeing these magnitude scales, if you're not familiar with earthquake magnitudes, this is a logarithmic scale. So significantly more energy is being released in these 7.8 and 7.5 earthquakes than these aftershocks. Oops, sorry. There we go. And when a large earthquake happens like this, we often map them as singular dots on a map, but the reality is much more complicated. And so for a 7.8 magnitude, which is the main magnitude, that is a fault that was about 300 kilometers long and had slip displacements, meaning the ground shifted relative to one another up to 10 meters in some locations at depth. And even the subsequent 7.5 magnitude earthquake was about 100 kilometers long on the fault. And this is just a map showing estimated surface displacements from satellites. And you can see upwards of -4 to +4 meters of displacement observed by the satellites along these two fault strands, indicating a significant amount of surface rupture, which contributed to some of the high damage in the area. This is just another figure showing the details of the slip on the fault zone. So when you're looking at this figure here on the left, you can basically imagine that you've peeled off the surface layers of the earth, and these lines here, these surfaces are the actual fault zone, and the colors are telling you how much slip was located on different areas of the fault. Again, these things are not dots on a map. They're long, they're complicated. They take time to rupture. So from where the earthquake started to when the fault sequence was completely finished rupturing took about a minute for these large magnitude earthquakes. That's also why shaking is so intense and why it lasts so long, because a large amount of the fault is actually slipping. So this is again showing the 7.8 fault zones in the forward part of this figure, and then the 7.5 fault zone that ruptured orthogonally is this one in the top portion of this figure. This is part of why there was such devastating shaking, particularly along the fault zone. And so this is a map of shake reports from people that were nearby the earthquake. And you can see it's getting close to the highest magnitudes on this scale. And even far away from the fault, there was still mild to moderate shaking reported throughout the region. The proximity of this fault to population centers and the magnitude of these quakes and the two quakes coming in sequence to one another after the first one had already caused significant damage has led to really devastating consequences, nearly 60,000 deaths and 100,000 injuries in Turkey and Syria, which puts this earthquake now at the 5th deadliest that we've had in the 21st century. So just some global context for when we see earthquakes like this and what we should think about as it pertains to other locations in our everyday lives. So this earthquake occurred along a transform boundary, a strike-slip fault. And as I mentioned, right, it was a 7.8 and 7.5. That's much lower magnitude than the largest magnitude earthquakes that we have on the globe. Those earthquakes typically occur at subduction zones. Some famous ones recently were the 2004 Sumatra Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, the 2011 Japan earthquake and nuclear disaster at Fukushima, which were both greater than magnitude 9. But this earthquake sequence is an important reminder that even though these transform boundaries are typically lower magnitude events, they can be just as, if not more dangerous, due to the fact that these faults might be much closer to population centers, leading to more significant shaking. And this earthquake is among the highest magnitudes ever observed with modern data for strike-slip earthquakes. The map on the bottom is showing a map of fault rupture from the largest sequence of strike-slip earthquakes that was ever observed. This occurred in 2012 in the Indian Ocean, where we had a magnitude 8.6 event. And again, similar to this Turkey earthquake, in order to get these high magnitudes on these transform boundaries, you're often talking about rupturing multiple faults at the same time, which is what happened in that sequence. I think whenever one of these damaging events occurs, it is useful to take away, what we can learn from seeing what happens and apply it to other locations. And in particular, especially in the US, a system that jumps out as being very similar to the strike-slip faults that we have in Turkey is the San Andreas fault. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake was estimated as about a magnitude 7.8, 7.9. Similarly, along a transform system, these are just some photos of the damage after the fire there. And so it's definitely an important reminder of where we do think that we can have similar magnitude earthquakes at other locations on the globe. And just briefly to end, I was asked a little bit to just mention relevance to Hawaii. Hawaii doesn't have transform boundaries, but we do have high seismic hazard. And it is worth reminding us all that Hawaii, especially the Big Island, has comparable seismic hazard to the West Coast of the United States and Alaska. The highest is on the Big Island, but even Honolulu still has elevated seismic risk. And so again, it's important to take away when we see these events, a reminder of what it might mean closer to home in terms of what we can do for preparedness. And I'll just end, with just a listing of some of the large magnitude earthquakes that we do know have occurred in Hawaii. The largest one that we have historical evidence for is in 1868, the magnitude 7.9 Kau earthquake and tsunami. But there have been other considerable ones, several of them reaching the upper magnitude 7s. So it is an important reminder for us here in Hawaii that this is an area that experiences large magnitude earthquakes. So I will end there.
Thank you, Helen. That was very interesting. So our next speaker is Mr. Michael Vorse. Michael Vorse is a president of SiteTour 360, who specializes in mapping and capturing 360 imaging well, integrating it with the Google Street View. Recently, he's been assisting us with a lot of damage assessments after disasters, and he's assisted some of the, I guess, 360 imaging community in Turkey. Michael, are you on?
I was muted. Now I'm on. Okay, let me get the screen share going here. It should be this one. Sure. Mute myself. Am I unmuted?
Yeah, you're
Yeah,
unmuted.
okay. And can you see my slideshow?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, as Eric said, my name is Mike Vorse with SiteTour 360, and we've had a great opportunity of working with Dr. Kim and his group, utilizing 360 imagery to kind of document natural disasters. We recently, I'm going to focus this talk on Turkey. Some of these slides don't apply as much, but I'm going to go ahead and just breeze through here. So first thing you might ask is why 360 imagery? Well, if you're familiar with Google Street View, you drop down into a 360 and you can turn 360 degrees. You can see everything. So you can very quickly document large areas. And 360 imagery really gives good context, especially when you integrate it with other data sets. You get a real sense of place and a visual impact of the damage. And you'll see this in the Turkey footage that we've captured. We do a lot of different data acquisition services, but we're primarily focused on 360 imagery. How we got into this is we got heavily involved with the Google Street View program. And we started our first disaster that we documented was Hurricane Michael up in the Panhandle of Florida in 2018 or 19, I believe. Dr. Kim got in contact with us when he saw that work, and that's led to a bunch of different other projects that we've done. And we did extensive collection in the Bahamas after Hurricane Dorian and a number of other projects. And we've also been able to refine the interface and the workflow, and we've upgraded our cameras kind of in the context of what you need to do when you're trying to, the conditions when you go into for a natural disaster. And our most recent disaster project, other than Turkey, was Hurricane Ian. We collected about 600 miles of imagery there. And we did a project for a large utility company, which we collected about 700 miles of imagery. And everything we've learned from all of these projects we've done has kind of fed into being able to more efficiently do these type of projects. So in particular for Turkey, you want to think of how are you going to plan for doing something like this? Well, most natural disasters you can't plan for. I mean, a hurricane, you have a few days, but Turkey, we had no time whatsoever. It just so happened that I had met a gentleman from Turkey who is a Google Street View photographer and does 360 imagery. I met him at the Google Street View Summit in 2019. And when the earthquake happened, I messaged him and he was already out collecting. And we volunteered our services to help him take the imagery he was collecting and get it online and make it accessible so that people that want to study it or for any purposes, research purposes, could have access to it. You always have to consider field conditions. When you go into a hurricane, you're not going to have power or water, or may not have gas in Turkey. The gentleman's name who did the collection is Ahmed. He couldn't go a lot of places initially, of course. There were a lot of restrictions by the government. The government is particularly sensitive about this information. It's kind of casting a bad light that they feel on some of the government policies over there, the number of buildings that have collapsed. So we have to work with that. You have to select the right equipment. In this case, Ahmed had a suitable camera. He was already there. After the imagery is collected, it's got to be processed. It's got to be uploaded. It's got to be hosted somewhere. It's got to be made into a usable format. And then lastly, you're dealing with really large data sets. We have about 250 kilometers of imagery from Turkey right now. And that represents 56,000 panoramas. And by the time the project is done, we'll probably have over 200,000 panoramas. So you can imagine it's a lot of data that you're having to upload and make accessible. The camera in the upper left here actually is the Insta360 Pro 1. It's a prosumer grade camera. You can get them nowadays for about $1,000 used. And that's what Ahmed happened to have over there. And as you'll see from the imagery, it's perfectly suitable. The other one is on the screen is an industrial camera, the square looking one that we've used in the past. We're currently using this Mosaic 51. It can integrate more sensors. It's more industrial. It has removable hard drive. It's just more suited for doing large collections. And we've used numerous cameras depending on the conditions. And then mounting the camera, depending on your collection, you may have to, you can see there's a vehicle mount, a backpack, it's mounted on a bike, on a boat, on a golf cart, walking. I even had a tube mount made for it for floating in a river. So when you're doing natural disaster collections, you need to be versatile and be able to, mount the camera however you need to do your collections. So as it happened in Turkey, like I said, my friend Ahmed was there. His company's Macro 360. He was already collecting imagery. He would do his collections. He had power at his home. He had internet, so he would come in at night, offload the camera, upload it to Google Drive, and then my business partner, the technical director, would download the imagery. We had to do heading correction data. It was slightly offset, so we had to do some data correction to the imagery. Due to the sensitivities in Turkey, we had to apply blurring to the imagery, anonymize the people and the vehicles. Then we uploaded it to a server, created a viewer platform, which I'll show you here. And additionally, we had to apply require login credentials for people to view the imagery because it's limited to just certain parties that can view it, which was part of the agreement we had to establish in Turkey to be able to collect the imagery. Here is Ahmed's vehicle. You can see nothing particularly special. I think it's a Fiat Panda. In this particular case, it was actually a good vehicle to use. It's small, easy to maneuver. You can see his camera mounted on the top. That's that Insta360 Pro. And I believe he just has it mounted on a monopod. And that was 100% suitable for the collections that he did. This is a screenshot. I'm going to share the actual project in a second and show you it live, but this is a screenshot just to show you what the project looks like. All the imagery is hosted. And when you open up the viewer on the left-hand side, you have a map. The little blue arrow represents the current point of view, where it's looking. The black lines are the routes that Ahmed has collected. The dots are a data set we got from OpenStreetMap's humanitarian project. The red is supposed to represent a significantly damaged building. Blue is moderate, and green is supposedly undamaged or just minorly damaged. And then you can see in this particular case, as it happens in Turkey, there was Google Street View imagery that was collected just last year in most cases. So we have a really good comparison. The top right hand is the imagery that Ahmed has collected, and then synchronized in the bottom right is Google's imagery, the nearest panorama pointing in the same direction. So even though it's really hard to tell, you're looking at the same view here. And that dual viewer is a really good tool for doing an initial assessment of like what was there before versus what's there now. So you can maybe pinpoint buildings that you want to study or make determinations about general structure. This is another view. This is just a screenshot on the bottom right. You can see the hotel there, and the after imagery top right, it is gone. So there again, it's a real easy way to make a comparison. I'm going to upload the project. I'm going to open up the viewer here. Hopefully this will work. Is everybody seeing that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. we put in here, this is another thing, the people that are authorized to use it have to agree to the terms of service. The imagery can't be shared. We have some partners that are helping fund Ahmed to collect the imagery, and in return for that, they have access to the imagery through the viewer now, and they'll be provided with copies of the original imagery at some point of time in the future. So here is the viewer. You can take just a couple quick walk through the features. You can drag over here so you can get a bigger view of the map. And you can zoom out, and at some point those OpenStreetMap dots disappear, but the routes stay there. And then as you zoom further out, you can see, and this kind of parallels a lot of what he collected is pretty close to the fault lines that were being shown earlier. So he's collected 1, 2, and then you go down here, here's 3, 4. So you've got a map that's really easy to navigate around, to go to areas that you wanted to look at, zoom in, and then like I said, you can drag back here if you're more interested in actually seeing the imagery. We've added a feature here where you can turn off the Google Street View, so you're just seeing the post event imagery. I'm going to turn the Google Street View back on and just show you a couple of things here. The imagery is pretty well synchronized spatially. If you'll notice here, I turn to the side, you can see that same image of the 2 children and the person in the top frame and the bottom frame. Now they're off by probably 3 or 4 meters or so, but that's just because where Ahmed took the image and where Google's nearest Street View image is off by that much, but they're close enough that it's actually quite useful for doing that comparison feature. And you can see the person. I'll advance a frame here so you can advance just like you would in Google Street View. You can see there's a person that's blurred out here. And there we blurred out the whole body and whole body of people, and we also blurred out vehicles. Now on the map, if you look on the left-hand side, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but we set the map up such that you could click, say if I click on a red dot, it's automatically going to move the viewer, and it's going to open up, even though I didn't click on the line, I clicked on a feature, it'll automatically open up the nearest panorama to that feature, and with the camera looking at that feature, and then the street view is synchronized down there below. So you can see that, that's a red mark building, and it is totally destroyed. And here you can see the blurring in the top frame, the stuff we blurred. It blurred out the entire vehicles and the people. We found it to be actually pretty accurate, very few misses. At a certain distance, it won't blur, but up close, it was perfect for what our uses were. And you can see here, like in this particular block, I think the only thing that's left is that one little, looks like a little fast food restaurant or something. This entire block is just devastated, essentially. But to kind of recap here, the 360 imagery allows you to go in, collect large areas, and do comprehensive collection. And then you can use the Google feature to do an initial assessment and comparison. You can look at structure types and generally see what survived and what didn't. Now this data is also, this is just one part of the one piece of the puzzle. We're working on being able to integrate this 360 imagery with other data sources. Now I'm going to see if I can switch back to my I can't switch back to my. Let me stop. I'm going to stop the screen share for just a second. Let me go again, see if I can get to my presentation. Well. Apologies here, I'm having a little screen share issue. There we go, and there. Okay, am I back to the
Yeah.
Yep, okay. So just to kind of recap, the 360 imagery, it can be challenging to collect. You've got to plan well, but having that permanent record can be very important for current, it can, if it's collected quick enough, it can assist in response, but it's also good for recovery to monitor progress over time. And like I said, it's a permanent record. It can give valuable context to other data sources. There's more tools becoming available. Historically, it hasn't been able to be that well integrated into ArcGIS, but they're working on features for that. And we anticipate in the next year or two, it's going to be a lot more useful inside ArcGIS. In addition, being able to apply AI or machine learning tools to the imagery could be useful for doing damage assessments and that. And that's another thing that I think somebody on Dr. Kim's team is working on. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
I'm going to
we
stop
got
my share.
So we get moving. We got our next speaker is Mr. Charles Ham. Charles is a PhD student with the Department of Urban Regional Planning at the University of Hawaii. He's currently providing support on our USAID InvestDM project that's to support Indonesia's BNPB, which is their version of FEMA. Charles also provided support to BNPB as they were providing response to Turkey. So take it away, Charles.
Thank you, Eric. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, Helen, for explanation on the below the surveys of Anatolia, and also Mike for what is seen from above. I'm going to talk about what happened on the ground in regards of the human part, the social science, and the effect that the earth movement and the earthquake affected the region. As mentioned before, over 50,000 people were casualties as far as death on the ground. 17.9 million people affected. A lot of buildings, 214,000 buildings collapsed in Turkey alone. And the estimated loss still not very clear. The World Bank estimate about $34 billion. The United Nations estimate about $100 billion. I think we will only see the actual number of losses once they account much more detail. The report says 530 billion infrastructure were exposed, and also including 1.74 million Syrian refugee affected. So as explained, here's a picture of the surface rupture that happens down in Antakya area in southern Turkey, where you can see there's hundreds of meters of surface open up because of the pushing, the slip that happens, and thank goodness it didn't affect the community there and the village, Tepehan village there. But also today is actually a special day for the people of Turkey, because I'd like to offer my happy Eid Mubarak, because today is a big holiday in Turkey and many Muslim countries, which is 25% population of Earth is 25% Muslim. So this is a special day, and I think many would have attended if the date was on a different timing. But the pushing of the Earth surface create movement and destruction on the ground, and also to the houses and the human being. I was on the ground, as Eric mentioned, embedded into the Indonesian delegation that came 200 people. And here's a picture that I was able to take on the ground, what happened after. And we look at the picture before that is available on the Google map, which is public access. And we can compare even based on the location where how the building looks before the earthquake, including some places that were flattened, and also some much more outside in Samantak village. We can see not just the big buildings, but single household buildings also affected as well. And then the displacement that affected the people, they had to stay in tents in the middle of winter and trying to survive as the challenges present them. So Indonesia was requested by Turkish government to provide assistance, and President Indonesia, President Joko Widodo, sent international assistance with search and rescue personnel along as a field hospital to provide the help. And NDPTC was asked to provide technical assistance. That's where I was sent by Dr. Kim to support the delegation head who went there with the team. Field hospital was set up along with the search and rescue team on the ground, doing their urban rescue for the victims and the casualties for proper respectful burial. Here's a map of where I traveled with the Indonesian team. As you can see, A is the point where the rescue team was based along with the other international urban search and rescue coordinated by the UN. And then point B is where the field hospital was set up in the town of Hassa. And also point C is where the logistic warehouse and the kitchen where they provide food for the team and also for the community they serve. It's the Hatay province where I travel with the Indonesian delegation. Here's a damage report from IOM, how many people affected and the impact. NDPTC was sent to support the Indonesian delegation running interagency operation with different departments, different ministry, trying to help the Turkish government relieving such a massive humanitarian situation as Turkish government and the Turkish Red Cross also provided the help during the 2004 tsunami and also the various disaster afterward. There are a few lessons learned that I'd like to share that we can think of as academic and international community. First of all, is the inclusive collaborations. It is important in disasters that we collaborate with the different partners, stakeholders, inclusively. As we see on the left diagram, it's the cluster system that the UN and international organization collaborate based on the cluster: food, nutrition, health, water and sanitation. This is how international disaster response are organized. And then in the middle, you see their level of international collaboration all the way to the individuals. How do you not only collaborate between nations or regions or at the national level, but also down to the communities and the individuals? It is important that we promote collaboration between different levels. And most importantly, on the right diagram, the importance of civil society. Many call civil society as the third sector. In this diagram, civil society is actually the meeting point of the citizen sector, the private sector, and the public sector or the government. So civil society is considered by this writing about a meeting point. How do we provide civilized support to the community? Secondly, the importance of community resilience and rules engagement. UNDRR described resilience as the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to, transform, and recover from the effects of a hazard. So resilience is a big issue that we need to consider, as the infrastructure resilient framework on the right side provided by the UNDRR, stressing 6 keys in promoting resilience in infrastructures. Thirdly is the issue of access to quality basic services. This is a problem in disaster response. If people are not suffering, then we can quickly build houses and do other things, but people lack access in basic services. Just like the Sustainable Development Goal, we need to consider, even before disaster, how do we provide equitable quality access to basic services to people around the world, not just during disaster, but before, because after a disaster takes place, it will be much easier to access the services and less issues secondarily. Number 4 is the all hazard approach mitigation. Helen has explained the risk of earthquake hazard in Turkey that we know from the scientific part, but also understanding that hazard is not just earthquake in places like Turkey, but it also consider other issues, biological, chemical, human disease outbreak, as we all experience COVID-19 pandemic. And there's many issues that we should be doing all hazard approach. And number 5 is caring for vulnerable and isolated communities. Syria, just down the road, 3 miles of where we were, but we could not access Syria. So these 5 points hopefully we can all learn and help our world to be a better community. Thank you. Back to you, Eric.
Thank you, Charles. I want to thank all our presenters. Let's open it up to questions. If people are putting in the chat, or you want to come on and ask your questions.
Well, I'll jump in and first thank everyone for really excellent presentations. And part of it is I see a lot of the connections that we're trying to build between scientists and engineers and planners and emergency managers and others that are involved in both response and recovery activities. And so part of this involves collecting usable, actionable data and information and transforming it into information. But I think it also involves trying to address many of the physical problems, the structural problems that exist, both in terms of the immediate humanitarian needs, but also hopefully in a way that can help to reduce the likelihood of longer term threats and injuries. And so what I'd like to do is encourage first the panelists, if they wanted to react to any of the information that was presented. I mean, maybe Helen could react to this as well.
Yeah, sure. I thanks for the presentations by the other presenters. It was really interesting to see this from a very different perspective than the way I normally look at this. I think one thing too that jumps out to me is, the comments at the end about, in some ways the best time to be prepared, be preparing for natural disasters before it happens, right? That absolutely rings true. And at least from my perspective, it seems like earthquakes and some other natural disasters are always so difficult to communicate that due to the length of time in between events and the loss of generational remembrance of when a previous one of these happened, and how to communicate to people that live in these regions the potential for a low probability but high impact event happening in their lifetime. I don't know if that prompts any thoughts from the other two presenters of how we do that, particularly on these, quite very impactful events like the earthquake we saw in Turkey and Syria.
Yeah, Helen, I had a question for you. I don't, maybe it's something you know about. Have we gotten any better at any prediction or indicators before these earthquake events, or is it still just?
No. Yeah, so earthquake prediction is not a thing. Earthquake forecasting, there are some aftershock forecasts that happen. So meaning when a large main shock like the 7.8 occurs, USGS does have United States Geological Survey does have some things that they do to put out a forecast of the magnitude of aftershocks and locations along the fault zone where expected shaking might be occurring. But in terms of anything before that large magnitude earthquake occurs, there's nothing there. Certainly, what we do know we can do is we can invest in denser instrumentation, geologic studies in paleoseismology, so that's looking at the rocks, trying to see if there's evidence of where earthquakes occurred hundreds or thousands of years ago, and algorithms that allow us to better and faster analyze seismic data. All of those things can give us more insights on where faults are located, how they are moving in between seismic cycles, and if there are faults at depth that don't have surface features that we can map. That at least lets us know where the potential areas of high risk for earthquakes might be in the future. But in terms of timing, there's nothing there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, if I may add what Helen mentioned about preparedness, it is important that the knowledge that we have through science, whether the earthquake, the seismic mapping, and how do we put that knowledge into actions in preparedness. And John Friedman talked about planning, having to transform our society in doing social reform. How do we analyze our policies? How do we improve social learning among the community? And also, how do we mobilize the society for a better change? And this is a challenge that we all face, that we must try to push forward for a better society we live in. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you. I think you do more than I do probably for that.
Yeah, I see there's a question from Rodney regarding graft and shakedowns on the ground. And I think we have to be concerned about, and I think Mike touched on some of this in terms of the operating environment, and it's all in part related to the context, which is important. And part of the reason that we went ahead and embedded Charles with the Indonesians is that we had a very long-standing working relationship with BNBP, and BNBP was coordinating the efforts of the military and others that were coming from Indonesia to support this effort. I mean, I think that these issues about how you manage personnel, collecting data, sending people out into these hazard zones, I think it's a very important thing that we work at. And so that was a good and important question. I see too that Dylan is on. I don't know, Mike, if you want to invite Dylan to say a few words, maybe he can say a little bit about the collection in Fort Myer, because I know he did a lot of the work there.
Yeah, Dylan, are you close by there? He may have stepped away.
Okay.
But yeah, that was, speaking to what's involved in doing this collection, you kind of initially you may think of, oh, you take some pictures and you put them on the internet, but as with any data collection, it's the planning and the technical aspects that go into it and managing, in particular, the 360 imagery. Dylan's really good with that technical aspect of creating these projects. And there's a lot that's involved in getting this workflow down, and we can get imagery live in about 24 hours now, but it's taken a long time for us to get to that point to figure things out. And then in a comment too, when you mentioned the situation in Turkey, I mean, the situation is always going to be different, but like when we were in the Bahamas, the government was very sensitive because they're a tourist-based economy. They're sensitive to having imagery and kind of stuff that's out there for people to see that presents the place in a negative light. Like they didn't want us to publish anything to Google Street View, which I could understand. And, we typically don't publish any damage imagery to Google Street View because they don't like it. And then in Turkey, you had the additional factor of the government had been very pro-growth for the last 20 years and promoted a lot of construction. And unfortunately, the rules or the building codes and that kind of stuff, they know how to build for those type of, events there, but they weren't followed. And then with the massive loss of buildings, it presented the government an extremely not so good light, and they were very sensitive. And that, that was another situation where there's a lot of difficulties getting in, probably to do anything, but especially for us to capture imagery. They had a lot of concerns about that.
Yeah, and I think also one of the things that we're working on is the difference between different types of hazards. It's not just different countries and different environments and different contexts. It is the differences between a wildfire, a tornado, a hurricane. And so part of what we've been trying to work on is to capture the imagery, to integrate the rapid damage assessment tools across these different hazards and threats. I think Charles mentioned also that it's not just the physical hazards and threats, but actually some of these are especially related to the transmission of disease, or some of the chemical biological hazards that can be unleashed by a big event. And how do we capture that type of damage? And so I think some of this really does circle back to the work that Amy is doing, thinking about the critical infrastructure, thinking about the roads, the power, the water, other services that if they fail, they create potential hazards and other threats as well too. So I don't know, Amy, if you had any reaction to some of the things that were presented. I know you're going to do your whole thing tomorrow, right? But any thoughts on the connections between the recovery from the earthquake versus the recovery from the volcano?
Definitely. There's a lot, but I'll try to condense it. It really, I think what Helen was talking about, the prevention, thinking about a disaster before, and I think this could relate to any disasters within this region, especially given the gap of time. Really, this is what we saw in Lower Puna, that gap of time, that the absence of any locally sourced eruption between 1969 and 2018. That is a wealthy length of time. So people kind of forgot or kind of downplayed the risks that they were actually living in that was previously very well known. And then again, the recovery efforts after. Now that a disaster happened, we know it happened, we have all the statistics and the numerical modeling. What do we do now? How do we build back better But again, like with my project, building back better might have some drawbacks, but you can't just abandon people. So it's very complex. So I think the thinking before, during, and after, and especially after, is critical.
Yeah, those are really good points you're raising and kind of connecting all of us to the work that we're doing. I mean, part of it is the response efforts, but I think the really messy, difficult work involves recovery. And so using these tools, not just to support the planning and decision making, but also to monitor and evaluate over time, not just the pace, but the nature of the recovery, I think is really powerful. And then ultimately, as you all know, that this is about training and education and capacity building. And so what the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center is committed to is building capabilities and using technology in a way to support the response and recovery requirements, but also to bring together, as we did today, the scientists and engineers and planners and those who are heavily involved in humanitarian assistance. So once again, I want to thank you all for really excellent presentations. And so I don't know, virtual clapping is kind of hard to do, but thank you all very much for really excellent presentations. And I hope that we can continue to have our third Thursday events and continue to interact and share information and work together